So a large part of the book, as we discussed, is about the sort of the constitutional weakness of England with regard to Britain. The EU's constitution, by contrast, the imposition of the Lisbon Treaty, you describe as miserable, secretive, sly and duplicitous. If we take instance or episodes like the Lisbon Treaty, along with episodes like Greece, the bailout, TTIP, to what extent is it the EU's own ideologies and errors that led to Brexit?
First of all, I think the European Union is the most wonderful and progressive institutional creation of my lifetime. That the nations which had gone to war with unimaginable ferocity and horror, decades after decades, over 2 to 3 centuries, consciously decided to, both their leaders and their people, to put that aside, to live in peace, to work together, to bring down their barriers, to bring down their borders, to work in terms of scientific research, in terms of culture, together, is the most remarkable and amazing achievement. And that sense that we can now be proud to be European, and that it's wonderful to travel across Europe, and Europe, this continent, is our home, and it's a made achievement, achievement of governments. So that is an enormous positive. Where the European Union leaders made a big mistake after the unification of Germany and coming out of the Maastricht Treaty was to go for a single currency without being willing to basically they had a kind, oddly enough, they had a sort of a Marxist view that they thought that the politics would follow the economy, and they did something which was they created the currency, and then very narrowly was supported in terms of the referendum in France. They went ahead with that, and then they decided that, given that they had this currency, that they had to constitutionalize. They had to actually, so to speak, make us citizens while acting from above, and constitutionalize this framework in order to democratize it. And they put that constitution, which is a long and elaborate document, to the people in France and in Holland. Holland is the most European country in a way there is, the one where population speaks the least. From what I can see, almost the entire population of Holland speaks at least 2, if not 3 languages. And they were thunderously rejected. And at that point, the leaders of the European Union, both the people in Brussels, but also the heads of state, including Blair, went ahead to create the Lisbon Treaty, which effectively imposed the constitution that had been rejected. So you have currently a European Union whose constitution has been created in the teeth of opposition, knowing that the people didn't want it, and deciding that at some point or other, in some way or other, the people would come round to it, and therefore assuming that the elite knows better, and it's built into the culture of the governing culture of the European Union that you don't have referendums of vermin, right? That the voice of the people should not be heard, that they know better. And that, in an age, now the age of the internet, an age where people want democracy and they want self-government, is a profound cultural and political flaw, and it means that they don't know how to actually speak to regular people. We can now see this in Catalonia. And this is a terrible legacy. Right? It's not even a legacy. It's a terrible thing which has happened. But when we look at it, there's something about the way the Anglo-British talk about this, which is very odd and I think very revealing. They talk about this as if this is a fixed monster, a legal system we can do nothing about, something which makes us powerless. Whereas we have a 350-year-old broken, undemocratic, top-down settlement which exists to preserve itself through thick and thin, which is much more difficult to change than the European Union. The European Union has been constitutionalising itself and reconstitutionalising itself more or less every decade. There was Rome, there's Maastricht, there's Lisbon, there are other summits as well. And so the European Union is quite a weak, one of the reasons for their reaction to Brexit is it's quite a weak and, in a way, rigid, threatened system of government. It's an exploratory, it's inventive. And if the people of Germany and France, or of England, if we were in it, and Spain and Italy, were to say, we do not want this, it wouldn't happen. The European Union has got no, in one sense, doesn't yet have an army of its own. It doesn't have its own police force. It can't impose its will. That's one of the reasons why it doesn't like democracy. It's got no. So the European Union is eminently reformable. It is a wonderful, inventive process that has gone wrong, but can be corrected. It is our union. It's the way we're governing our and to be outside of the currency and therefore outside of that process of the shared currency with all of its faults of austerity and its deflationary effects on the countries outside Germany. And yet still to be inside the European Union, as Poland is, for example, and it's growing at 4% per annum in terms of its economy, that is a great position to be in. So there's something odd here, and I was very struck by Norman Lamont was once asked, well, if you're so opposed to the lack of democracy in the European Union, why are you in the House of Lords? And he kind of simpered. Well, he said, I didn't make up the House of Lords. I didn't make up the British system, as if sort of this is something he has to be part of while taking no responsibility, although it's our own country. But when it comes to the European Union, he's on his high horse, and we can't have this and we can't have that. So there's the critique of the lack of democracy in the European Union is partly put in bad faith by many of those who put it in this country. Its lack of democracy is seen as somehow definitive, unmovable, immensely tough and threatening, and our own long historic lack of democracy as seen as something, well, we're familiar with it, it's not so bad, we can work around it, and this is resulting in Brexit, which, as I say, is a very profound breakdown of governance in this country.
But I mean, the examples you give of being able to change the EU, I mean, obviously, Britain has an incredibly imperfect democracy. But if we think about, 1945, 1979, 2016, people of this country still do and have had the means to bring about quite sort of fundamental, profound change in the country. The changes that the EU has gone through, by contrast, have all been top-down. At no point have the people of Europe imposed a sort of transformative change upon the EU or its structures. The Brexit vote itself, it's probably the first major thing to do that. It was a national vote. In what sense would you say that, from what we've seen over the last few decades, in what sense is the EU there to be reformed by the people of Britain, the people of the Netherlands, the people of France?
Well, that's a very good question. Well, first of all, you're right that there have been very big transformations in this country, and they have been in part driven by popular forces, although I think 1979 is rather dubious in that sense. It was a big change. It released a lot of pent-up energy, but there were other routes that could have been taken. Thatcherism wasn't. There were alternatives to Thatcherism, and they also would have released that energy that was building up in the 70s. Was going to, express itself in one way or another. This is a country of failed renewal. It's not a country which is now suffering just simply decline. It's been but Germany has renewed itself, has gone through very profound changes, including a very great reckoning with what it did during the war. My generation of Germans went through a very, very, very profound sense of actually kind of coming to a reckoning with their parents' generation, who were either Nazis or were collaborating with the Nazis on the whole. And France has gone through very big changes, including getting rid of Algeria and de Gaulle, and it's gone through. Spain used to be a fascist country, and it is no longer, and it's still arguing out the nature of what's going on. So it's not at all the case that we alone have done this. You just merely need to look at Ireland. What Ireland was a benighted Catholic backward society, and now Ireland is about to have a referendum on the legalisation of abortion, the legalisation of gay marriage. I mean, these are very big changes that are taking place across Europe. And one of the frameworks that has permitted these kinds of changes and allowed them to consolidate themselves has been the fact that we've not been at war with each other, right? That the old nationalisms have been put aside. And that has been willed by the people of Europe in different ways. So that's the first thing to say. And Europe is a form of sharing of sovereignty, not a new sovereignty imposing itself on us. Now, there's an element inside Brussels and inside the European Union which does seek to become another imperial power. There is that element. That's a fair criticism of it. But what I'm saying is that this is still a very weak, although it's a very ambitious and anti-democratic sort of project, if you like. It's not one that finds support in the chancellers's or with the presidencies or in Downing Street. It's not one that the prime ministers and the presidents and the chancellors of Europe leap to. On the contrary, they are opposed to it. And we need, this is where I support what Yanis Varoufakis is arguing for, we need a European movement that is rooted in a popular will to set about changing the way Europe is governed and the values by which Europe governs itself. Let me give you an example. I was struck by Boris Johnson kept on saying, well, look, when I was mayor of London, and I tried these lorries, they started to crush cyclists and they wanted to change the nature of the lorries, but I couldn't change them because of some regulation which was there in Paris. The French didn't want their lorries changed. Why didn't he make an appeal to cyclists across Europe to simply cycle to Paris and bring Paris to a halt until it changed its view, if that was the case? So said, oh my goodness me, we've got to suffer what Europe says. The constitution which they proposed was vetoed by a French referendum and a Dutch referendum. There is popular support across Europe for a different kind of Europe. And what I'm saying is that we need a European politics which builds on that. And if you say, well, it hasn't happened, as I think I see you leaping out, well, it's a very young organisation, the European Union, and we've now got to find a new way forward.
I suppose what I'm getting at is you give the examples of the Dutch and the French vetoes of the Constitution. But of course they weren't vetoes because they can only be done at a national level, because there are no levers with which the people of Europe can bring that sort of change that would allow them to veto a referendum, a constitution, to reject a constitution, to amend it, etc. So what they're left with is more, just sort of messages from their own countries, referendums, elections. They have no real means of leverage on the institutions of the EU. This is my first point, coming back to the example of the British equivalents. The second point you say with regards to Johnson, simply round up cyclists from across Europe. And I think this is the same point that applies to Varoufakis and DM25. Again, is it not one of the weaknesses of the EU from a democratic perspective? That not only have you got the difficulties you have within a national polity of driving change, you've now got to secure a majority support for what you want to do across 28 countries. I mean, how in what sense do you have a better democratic grasp, having to work across 28 countries, very different cultures, languages, in what sense does that compare to national democracy such as Britain?
Right, well, I'm not against national democracy. I'm not for losing national democracy.
No. What I mean is you suggested that there is an equivalence with the EU, and that we shouldn't view British politics as something that we can impact on. We shouldn't view the EU as something we cannot impact on because of the examples given. So what I'm saying is, how would you justify the claim that we do have the means, the leverage to change the EU's institutions that we do at home?
We don't have the same leverage over the European Union, or we wouldn't have had if we'd stayed in the European Union, which I hope we will do, than if we as voters have over our own government. But I'm not against. I'm not in favour of the European Union becoming a single country. The votes of the people of Holland and France actually said they didn't wish this. There isn't a democratic consent for that. So I am for the nations of Europe sharing their sovereignty over areas where this clearly benefits us. It clearly benefits us in terms of education. It's clearly essential in terms of climate change. We ought to be able to do it in terms of agriculture. It benefits us in terms of the single market if we can make things which can then travel, without barriers across the European Union. And in order for that to happen, there has to be a shared regulatory space with shared laws of trade and not just of trade, but if you want to sell financial services and if you want to share products, then you need to actually have a regulatory environment which is unified, and then together that makes a regulatory unit which can then trade, with some strength in terms of other competitors around the world. So, all that seems to me to be something which is obviously good and extremely difficult to arrive at. And it shouldn't involve the liquidation of national politics. It doesn't mean that we can't have a health service which is different from the health services of other countries. It doesn't mean that we can't have the government of our towns and cities in terms of, of how we drive it, or how we, very large amounts of how we govern ourselves remain part of our own government. And if you go to Germany, or you go to Italy, or you go to France, you're in a different country which is also sharing sovereignty with your own. And that is a difficult thing to do, and that the European Union is failing to do it in terms of its economic policies and in terms of German domination of the euro. Yes, of course that's right. But my fundamental argument here is that the fate of Europe is our fate. You could even say it, to be over dramatic perhaps, with appeasement. We tried to walk away. When we were an empire, when this country was an empire, tried to walk away from the European Union, and the result was a catastrophic war. And this was a catastrophe for us as well. The one saving grace of this war was that Britain wasn't itself invaded and its institutions weren't overturned. But one result of that is we now still have institutions which are deeply embedded in the 19th century imperial values and imperial consciousness, with a great nostalgia for that period, which is a fatal drawback in the modern world. So I think that you need to start at the other things. That, this is our continent. Its fate is our fate. We have to be part of that argument. We can lose that argument, we can win that argument, but it's our argument and it's our continent, and it will decide what kind of a country we are. And we can't separate ourselves from that. We can't say, well, Europe can be as undemocratic as it wishes to be, and so on, and we're going to be completely different. And and there's even a sort of a Lexiteer argument that we can introduce a kind of, egalitarian democratic socialism in the United Kingdom, right? So the United Kingdom will become a democratic socialist sort of, example to the rest of the world, show the rest of the world how to be, while Europe becomes a reactionary, semi-fascist, sort of populist, oppressive, undemocratic place, this is very unlikely, to put it mildly.
Sure, but I mean, I think, your views on the sort of relative strength between the national and the transnational are one thing, and you said in the book, you've said a few times that the Federalists have lost. The superstate is no longer on the agenda. Brexit is essentially the end of that side of the project. But isn't there a sense in which, for the Federalists themselves, Brexit is really the beginning of that process, and that now, without the sort of difficult neighbour that was Britain in the way, they feel that actually this is exactly what's needed and what they need to do, and what they now have the freedom to do. I mean, if you look at Juncker's speech, there is no sense at all in which this is a defeat for federalism. This is this is a real embrace for them, that they feel this is really the time and this is the opportunity now that they have to push forward. Monetary union, fiscal union, banking union, European defence, etc. I mean, is it not the case that really Brexit is just going to give more force to centralisation in Europe now?
Well, I think that Brexit was a reactionary and negative blow to which the European Union will respond by strengthening its own reactionary and negative aspects. Juncker's always struck me as a rather unconvincing figure. He's on his way out. His struggles with alcohol are well known. I've never taken him very seriously. I take Merkel seriously. I think Macron is very interesting. I think his attempt to push a kind of modern federalist model is very likely to fail. I think you've seen the rise again now in Austria of the far right. Is given the nature of the European Union, it's got to proceed by agreement. It means that this federalist model that you have outlined, it may be the wet dream of bureaucrats in Brussels, but it's not going to come about if the people and governments of Europe don't want it. And we should be part of stopping that. And it's quite a difficult one. Thing where I haven't been able to make up my mind on the euro is whether my instinct, which is it should be abandoned because the logic of the euro is such a profoundly anti-democratic one, it is bound to fail. So the sooner you cut your losses, the better. Or whether the argument of those who know their economics better than I do, of saying the costs of trying at this point in time to unwind the euro are too great, and that it is a fait accompli, it can't be. The European nations who are part of it can't undo it, and that they're sort of stuck with it. And it therefore needs to be governed in a completely different way, which liberates the energy of cities and of municipalities and of different countries, and allows people to borrow and gives people real flexibility in terms of their different economies. But at the moment, that's not our argument. That's not an argument for us. The argument for us is, how do we reverse Brexit? How do we stop it if it can be stopped? And how do we reverse it if it can't be stopped?